Hello, and welcome to Conversations with me, Dr. Theo Blackmore, part of the Discover Voices Media Network. Brilliant. Hello. So my name is Theo Blackmore. I'm doing this podcast for the Discover Plus series of podcasts on behalf of Disability Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. And today I'm talking to
Eleanor Lisney. Although nowadays I add my Chinese name, so it goes very long. So it's Eleanor Chui Wa To Lisney. But Eleanor's fine.
Brilliant. Nice to see you again, Eleanor. It's been a very long time. We were trying to catch up and trying to figure out where we first met. And I think it might have been about 14 or 15 years ago. We were back in the day when I was traveling up to London and working up there quite a lot. So there's lots of things I'd like to talk to you about, but I'd also just like to talk to you about you. So what's your history? What's your origins? Where are you from? Where do you live? You live in London, I think, do you?
I live in London now. Yeah, when people ask me to introduce myself, this really gets a bit like, when is it going to stop kind of thing. Okay, I'm a Malaysian. I was a Malaysian. Born in Malaysia. I came to the UK to do to be at university, my first degree, and I got married immediately, stupidly. And
And what was your first degree?
English literature, English and American literature, and then with my ex, and at that time 2 children, we moved to France, Strasbourg, and then when the children were a bit older, I went off to the States to do postgraduate, and went back to France and couldn't get it when, as a disabled person. Even with 2 masters, I couldn't get a job licking envelopes.
And what was your 2 master's degrees? What were they in?
One was with Open University, continuation of my English Lit, and the other is on I forgot. I didn't forget, but the title of it. It used to be Library and Information Science. There you go, Information Studies. So sort of like websites, that kind of, nowadays it's called digital, but at that time it was still just information. At that time, so libraries were moving more into information and sort of the web and stuff like that. So I came back to the UK because I applied for a job at Coventry University, and they asked me for an interview, and I got the job. So then I stayed, came back to the UK, and then I got involved with Equality 2025. That was like ages ago. I don't know if you still remember it. And since then, self-employed.
Since then, what, sorry?
I'm self-employed. I never went back to working for people. Since then, from Coventry, I moved to London. And there you are, very, very short summary.
Great. So that's lots of different countries you lived in. So do you speak all those different languages? Do you speak French? What language do they speak in Strasbourg? Is that German?
No, it's in France.
Strasbourg is in France. Oh, of course it is. Sorry. Yeah.
No, people confuse it with Salzburg, but it isn't. It's Strasbourg, and that's where the Council of Europe is. That's where my ex was working for. So I think at the last count I speak 4 languages. although I can't say I speak them all fluently. And then for Chinese, I speak Cantonese, which is my mother tongue, and Mandarin very badly.
Wow, that's it's a lot of languages. Most people don't, from this country, as you know, we go abroad and live in other countries and don't speak their language. So that's
I know, but I'm still very, very ashamed of my lack of Chinese. I mean, my Malay was never good, but then, Malay is not that frequently used, so I'm let away with that. But yeah, so I'm still trying to catch up with my Chinese, my Mandarin anyway.
so. When I first met you, I remember you were back in the day. You were using an electric wheelchair. Have you always been a disabled person, or have you?
I am still using an electric wheelchair. I had polio when I was 3. So, but in Malaysia, people don't really use wheelchairs. The terrain just doesn't really allow it even now. And also, we weren't very well off. And in Malaysia, I think wheelchairs might be out of the range of a pocket of a lot of families. I had a kind of walking stick. I walked very slowly. I think my mother carried me until, I don't know, secondary school, where I I learned how to use a bicycle. So until I came to England, my mode of transport was a bicycle. So yeah, uh, I love cycling. But when I came to the UK, I was in a terrain that wasn't at all suitable for bicycles, and I kept falling down. When I was at university, my mentor, who was also a wheelchair user, Dave Ransom, actually, Mike Oliver was in the same university as I was.
Wow.
Yeah, so I met him when he was doing his PhD and I was an undergrad.
Right. When was that? Was that in the 80s?
Yeah, so that's how old I am. So my mentor Dave told me, get yourself a wheelchair, woman. So I said, oh, okay. And the NHS did give me a wheelchair. So that after that, I got bought an electric wheelchair. And I needed that because then I had 2 children to worry about. Yeah.
So that's amazing. So you met Mike Oliver. Did you talk about disability politics with Mike Oliver back in the day?
No, in those days, sort of disability issues didn't really come into conversations.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, we just, I don't know what we talked about. If I remember so long ago, it's probably about the terrain because University of Kent University was up on a hill,
Right.
and the different colleges were quite separate. So it's quite an effort to get from one college to the other college. Darwin College to King's College could take you more than 15 minutes rolling.
So you mentioned you talked about Malaysia and how the terrain there isn't really very good for somebody who's using a wheelchair. I mean, I guess in many ways some of that hasn't changed, or some of it has changed. Are things different now? So if
When
you're
I say
in
yeah,
Malaysia,
when I said terrain, I don't mean it's not flat,
yeah,
but there are a lot of monsoon drains.
right,
Uh, there are very, very few curb cuts and crossings. So you practically take your life in your hands when you cross a road. And
yeah.
that's not just for wheelchair users, that's for all pedestrians, especially if you're in Kuala Lumpur. Can get very easily run over. I was back in Kuala Lumpur in August, and yeah, and my daughter was like, you know, I mean, she was helping me across the road and stopping traffic and things like that. She's much better at doing these things, and also because if you're a wheelchair high, as you know, people sometimes don't see you. Yeah, but yeah, it was fun. Yeah, I still don't recommend people going to Malaysia if you're a wheelchair user, not unless you've done a lot of homework and also you're willing to take, you're willing to be flexible. I mean, I can imagine somebody coming from London and they would be non-stop complaining.
Yeah.
Forget about the transport. I mean, some of the trams and subways there are accessible, but I only tried one. But this is not about Malaysia, and yeah. So.
Yeah, my son lives in Japan, and I often have conversations with him. I've not been there, I haven't been to Japan to visit him, but I don't think it'd be very easy in Japan. I think it's a very similar. The terrain is very, very similar to what you're describing. It's a bit
My daughter lived in Japan for a few
right.
years. She speaks Japanese. If you talk about linguists, my daughter is the top in several languages. But people tell me, and she's also said that Japan is actually quite accessible.
Oh, great.
So you should go.
So I'll go. Maybe I'll go.
Going to
Yeah,
visit her while she was there. So yeah.
great. So that's all brilliant. And you mentioned, so I had a look at the website, and so you set up an organization, I believe, called Sisters of Frida.
Yeah. Um, I didn't put it there, but I don't know if you realize I'm also one of the co-founders of DIPAC.
Of Deepak.
Yeah.
So
And
for people who don't know, people who don't know what that stands for, what that's Disabled People Against the Cuts.
disabled people against cuts, yes. I think October 3rd, 2010, we had a huge demo in Birmingham. And that, I think, was the start of it. At that time, it wasn't even called DIPAC. We didn't have a name. The name came later. Yeah. So there was others as well, but Linda Burnett, Debbie Jolly, and myself, and others.
Great. I mean, Deepak is an amazing organization, and it's still going. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about Deepak is it has a very different structure to many organizations because you have lots and lots of branches locally across the country, but it doesn't seem to be like a central. It's not a hierarchical organization in that same kind of way as many other organizations are.
No, it still isn't. I don't put it in there because it's such a kind of like big name, and I went up and started Sisters of Frida. Because I we got invited to speak at Trafalgar Square on domestic violence as disabled women, and then realized that there are disabled people's organizations and there are women organizations, but there are none that focus on disabled women. So very slowly, Sisters of Frida came about. I think it was 2014 when we became when we were registered. because we were we were there before, but just didn't have a kind of registration or name. But you speak about DPAC not hierarchical, and neither is Sisters of Frida. It's mostly a collective, although we do different things, and we're very slow. We're not big at all, and I don't know whether that's deliberate or whether because that's just we didn't have an example to follow, and so we sort of develop on our own kind of thing. Yeah, but now we have got some funding to do. We have a bigger steering group, and hopefully we will the steering group, the people in it, this is a reader will get bigger, whatever, I don't know. It's a collective.
So I mean, do you have other branches, or is there only one? Is there one organisation? Because you're in London, are there other branches of Sisters of Frida around the country?
No. Not a franchise. No, although people have asked us, and we don't see how we could do that and maintain. It's not a matter of control. It's a matter of, how do we keep what we say, the vision and the mission as it is, while we have other branches, as you say, we just didn't know how to do that. I think DPAC is different in the sense that it's very much up to the locality. I'm one of the co-founders of Greenwich DPAC, in fact, and it's mostly about cuts with the council and has very little to do with the national DPAC. Because it's just the name.
Yeah, I mean, we had a DPAC in Cornwall. I'm not sure if there is still one. But when I found out about the DPAC in Cornwall, I think the chap who ran it has since died, unfortunately. So I'm not sure if there's another branch, if it's still going down here in Cornwall. But it's the same issue across the country, isn't it? So there are cuts from local authorities across the board.
Mm.
So it's the same issue everywhere, I think.
Yeah, it's not the same. I think that maybe that's why I don't put DPAC under, my bio or whatever. It's because it'd be too complicated. That's too complicated to explain. But apart from Sisters of Frida, I've also, when we talk about being local, in my local area, another collective, and this is again disabled people's group called Cultural Access, which is mainly about culture, although of course we also have issues like disability justice and things like that added into it. But we look in it in a broader sense, more than just, how do I put it, campaigning. It's more about discovering different identities of disabled people. For example, we did, like, for Black History Month, we talked about the intersection of being Black and disabled. And for Disability History Month, we talked about the intersection about being an Asian, being being a person of color, not just Black, and being disabled. And we had a festival. We talked about being disabled and proud. We had performances. We had workshops, etc. So just recently we did collectively, because it's a co-production. They decided to did a piece of artwork together, which I'm very, very proud of, because I don't know that exists anywhere else. It might do, where you have deaf person, deaf people, blind and visually impaired people, wheelchair users, people who are neurodiverse, together deciding on how to put a piece of work together, and hoping to have a next exhibition soon, just waiting for the funding.
Right.
Yeah, but that's in.
It's very so your working style is very collaborative, very collective, isn't it? Very collectivist, it seems to me.
Yeah, because, well, sometimes I wish that I can just make the decisions, but I think I prefer to work with other people. Maybe then I don't have to take all the blame or the credit, I should say.
So we need to go back. So your organization is called Sisters of Frida. So for people who don't know, who was Frida?
Frida, we had as our sort of role model, Frida Kahlo, who is a Mexican artist, but she's racially mixed. I think her father was German and her mother was indigenous Mexican. And this is from memory. I think I'm right. She was an artist, and her art is very well known all throughout the world. She's a feminist. She was bisexual, a communist, all the things that we thought that's what a feminist should be, be creative, as well as having all the kind of socialist kind of ideas, and disabled. Although I must say a lot of stuff about her don't talk about her disability. She had polio, and then she had an accident, and her art reclaims the disability very, very much, about, yeah, a lot of her art talks about being disabled, not just physical disability, but also the sort of mental anguish about the babies she lost, and and all that sort of thing, and her relationships, so phenomenal, and we really admired her, so we say ourselves Sisters of Frida.
She's almost the exact definition of intersectionality. She has so many different intersectionalities.
In fact, Sisters of Frida had intersectionality right from the start, from the framework. I was told off at the beginning for using the word, saying that it was too difficult a word for disabled people.
What, the word intersectionality?
Yeah. And this was like, 2014, that sort of time, where it's not a word that people recognize. I mean, now it's like a buzzword. But at that time, it was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
It was too, inaccessible. And I said, well, sometimes it's not jargon. It describes exactly what it is. it's not diverse. It's not diverse. It's not just, you know, sort of saying that mixed identity or whatever. So yeah, it is very much intersectional, and yeah, Sisters of Freedom has always been intersectional, and it was right from the beginning.
And so, as an organisation, what does Sisters of Frida do?
We're mostly campaigning, really, on issues that affect disabled people. I say disabled people because we have also a lot of people who are non-binary, who, you know, we welcome. We don't, how do you put it? We're not a gatekeeper. If you say, you know, you have issues that affect you because of an identity as a sort of woman, then who are we to say you're not? Because because people only talk about trans women, there's a lot of trans men as well, who still have issues that connects us all, like, you know, smear tests at the hospital, that sort of thing, but more so because because those are important to us as well. And you go back to Frida Kahlo, you can see some of her paintings. She has, you know, she puts on a suit, a sort of kind of a masculine look as well, because it's, I don't want to speak on it because I don't think I'm an expert on it, but on gender issues, who am I to say you're not who you are, want to be, kind of thing. And that sometimes get us in trouble. But, you know, we don't depend on anybody. And that's, to a certain extent, we're careful with who we work for so that we don't get people cut off our funding or whatever, threaten us because of that or any other reason, actually. If that makes sense.
I mean, so you do campaigning work. What's your campaigning work about?
I should have looked it up before this, shouldn't I, so that I can remember exactly. One of our main things that we have been campaigning about was on disability and sexuality. And there was one in which we worked with Stay Safe East on, this is where I fail because I can't remember the exact titles, but we worked on a legal thing that says that women have rights when it comes to like domestic violence. So it doesn't have to be physical violence. It could be financial violence. It could be blah, blah, blah. Except if you're a disabled person. Because they say, or their carers who say, well, you know, we're just trying to protect them so that, you know, they don't spend all their money on things that they shouldn't be spending on, or, you know, so it's not just carers, it's just, we just thought that it was extremely unfair. And also things like parental benefits, rights, and all that. All those things get affected. And there are a whole load of things, like, for example, when it came to having parental rights, very often social workers will give the rights to the non-disabled person. Just because you're disabled, they say, well, you couldn't possibly take care of that child. And they call it childcare or whatever. My brain isn't obviously working very well today. I'm losing my my faculties. But things like, for example, even if they give the right to the perpetrator, the person who does the violence in the domestic, mostly male, they would do that because they really do not think that disabled people, mostly women, can be good parents. And that's just one of them, but there's loads. I mean, if you want to, I mean, if I had remembered to look into the website, there's I think it's called, I can't remember the exact name of the thing that we were fighting for. Because
I mean, but there's a lot of things in there that you've been talking about which ring lots of bells with me. I remember working with a woman who works in Cornwall with a domestic abuse charity down here in the county, and she had a telephone with her during the meeting. She said she couldn't turn the telephone off because she was waiting for a phone call because she was dealing with a case that was happening right then, and this very distressing situation that she was dealing with. And she said that the greater the more vulnerability that the individual experiences, the more likely they are to be the victim of domestic abuse or domestic violence. So that included what she described as a vulnerability of pregnancy. So when a woman becomes pregnant, if her husband is likely to commit domestic abuse, then that risk increases. And it increases, as you say, in all sorts of different ways. So it could be violence, it could be sexual violence, it could be financial control and coercive control, all sorts of different things. And I said to her, well, the situation for disabled people is that the dynamics throughout a relationship can change. So somebody like myself, I have multiple sclerosis. My situation can change from one day to the next in terms of my impairment. And so therefore vulnerability can increase. So if, somebody's acquires an impairment and they didn't have one before, then they might be more likely to be the victim of domestic abuse than if they didn't have an impairment. So you must be dealing with all sorts of kinds of issues when you're working with the people that you're working with.
Yeah. However, we're not a frontline.
At that time, I didn't know about Sisters of Frida, and there was no organization that I could think of to talk about in relation to disability and domestic abuse or domestic violence. And I was trying to help get something set up here in Cornwall, but there just is no funding around to do that kind of thing. I think there are 3, maybe 4 refuges in the county. And I don't know, I think there was one wheelchair accessible bed in one of the refuges. So what happens? It's incredibly complex for, I don't need to tell you, but it's incredibly complex for somebody who, for example, might be receiving a care package from social services. How do they then flee their domestic environment if it's an abusive environment and go somewhere else? Because there aren't accessible buildings for them to go to. Care packages don't move. It's incredibly complicated.
Yeah, that's the sort of things that we look at when we're looking at you know, when, the sort of campaigning and stuff. And one of the things that we're very, very small, so we're not a frontline organization, for example. So even if you come to us, we can only kind of like point you to some organizations that can help. And there are so few refugees in the whole country that can actually accommodate disabled people, whether it's a wheelchair user or a deaf person, and as you say, the care packages are so incredibly a barrier in a way. I mean, and even disabled people sometimes don't understand that, because I think I won't mention which organization, which funder we tried to go to, because we wanted to do research on how care packages affect us. Because it's not just if you have domestic violence. What if you're a young person, you fall in love? What if you live in East London, you want to move to West London, but you can't? You would have thought it was a very basic right. If you want to go and shack up with somebody, you should be able to. But not if you're a disabled person. And, this is part of the things that under the very broad heading of disability and sexuality. But this funder didn't say it, even though their advisory board was full of disabled people. They just thought, why don't you go and research on domestic violence instead? And we said, well, but anyway. So when you talk about funding, yes, and even disabled people themselves don't always get it. And I say that because when we started Sisters of Freedom, I had a very prominent disabled campaigner, activist. He came and then said, there's no gender in disability rights. What? What? And, it goes for all. And I was astounded. I didn't know what to say. This was on a public forum. Luckily, one of my colleagues jumped in and went there. But I was like, how could they say that? It's like there's no gender with disabled people, So that sort of goes on. And so even when it comes to disabled people's organizations and all that, there are those, how do I put it, misunderstandings, disagreements that we have to work with us, because they don't see the sort of difficulties or barriers you have, not just as a disabled person, but as a woman or as a queer person. And this is why we sort of embraced, when it comes to gender, because it just isn't there. So, like, oh, we never thought of that. I've had it said to me before, I've only ever been, when it comes to intersectionality, I've never been discriminated against except as a disabled person, and not because I was a person of color or because I was Black. And I'm going like, what? what kind of bubble do you live in? But
Yeah.
sometimes it makes it too complex, and it's like you're kind of like swinging between so many different yeah.
Wow, it's really interesting. So we started off this conversation before we put the record button on, talking about your podcast that you do. When you were talking about identity and culture in your podcast, apparently, is what you said to me. It's very interesting, that whole notion about identity and culture, because we are so many different identities and so many different cultures. So, at what point do we say, am I a straight, white, wheelchair using male, or am I a white, straight, wheelchair using male, or am I a wheelchair using straight, white? Do you know what I mean? What order do the words come in, and what order do we put our identities to the foreground? When do some identities foreground themselves, and when do they move to the back? What are the situations that happens in? And these are games that we have to play all the time as disabled people, especially if you are, not me being me, Theo Blackmore, being a white male. White males have it easy in many ways. There's so much more at play in the disability community, which is not acknowledged.
Yeah, it's just like very often non-disabled people don't understand the sort of barriers that disabled people face because they don't have that life experience. And I think for us, Sisters of Freedom is very important in that we recognize, and we try to recognize, because I wouldn't say we succeed every time, the intersections. For example, as you mentioned, I have a podcast, and my podcast is about, I said it's like the layers of the layers there are in an onion. You have, when you peel them, because on the face of it, and I said that the other day in a disability group, I am pure Chinese. I just had my DNA tested. However, I'm not Chinese because I'm not from mainland China. I'm born in Malaysia, and Malaysia is in Southeast Asia. And therefore, I have the influence of the mix that is in Malaysia. I grew up with Indians, Tamils. I grew up with Muslims, Christians, Confucian. My whole family Confucianist, and it's a very rich mixture. On the other hand, you can say, oh, great, it's great diversity. But on the other hand, it can be very unsettling, because how do you kind of decide where you belong? And I've been asked a few times to talk about intersectionality. And I've said that it sometimes means like you get invited, you are always invited to parties. Yeah. Because I tick so many boxes for a start. And then you find out that if I go and sit at the disabled table, let's start, I find that there are lots of things in me, about me, that doesn't quite fit there. And if I go and sit around the Chinese or the Asian table, then as a disabled person, I don't always fit in, because as a wheelchair user, you know that you'll always end up, oh, this is the place that you're supposed to sit at, kind of thing, whether you don't want to sit in the designated seat. This is no matter where you go. You go to church, they will say, this is where wheelchair users sit. So you go sit there, kind of thing. So that's what I meant. So in my podcast, I talk about being, yes, I'm Chinese, but I'm also Southeast Asian. And not only that, I lived more than half of my life in the West. So there's a lot of me, for example, the CRPD, it's very much ingrained in me. The social
model. What's CRPD?
Sorry, the Convention of Rights for People with Disabilities or Disabled People. So, for example, what was I going to say apart from the CRPD? Oh, yes, the social model of disability. Do you want me to go into that as well? Because the idea that it's not your disability, but your environment which disables you. I'm sure you can.
We started off this conversation talking about Mike Oliver, and it was Mike Oliver, of course, who famously coined the term social model of disability. So it's ingrained in you from the very beginning,
because of I've had training, in that, and actually I should say that my training in that actually starts in the USA. Because I was in Austin, Texas, and I used to go and listen to disabled people talk there. And I was working, and one of the things, in Massachusetts in School of Medicine, and one of the things that I was asked to do was to do a piece of curriculum on disability culture, and so it sort of started sort of in the United States, and then I moved to the UK, and my other disabled colleagues sort of built me up and taught me, and and I've taken that into my being, if you want to be called that. But at the same time, I am not so much a disabled person in UK and how they take it, as because of the influences I had abroad, in the sense that I do know that in a lot of the rest of the world, they don't see that, they don't understand that. And so you have to realize that just because although I'm sure a lot of British people would disagree with me, we are fortunate, we are privileged because we have that, and this is in a way why I'm a campaigner. It's because I can see how important it is, and how important it is that we make the most of it. And I would hesitate in saying we should be the example to the rest of the world, kind of thing, because the rest of the world have its own merits and its own things. And I've been looking at, for example, disability in films and dramas in China, and seeing the kind of disability that they portray there, which isn't portrayed here in the West. That sort of mixture. And I'm probably going off track here, Theo.
No, I mean, so there's lots of things in there, but the thing I want to pick up on is I saw a documentary, and it was on BBC Three, and it's a long time ago, a couple or 3 years ago, and it's called "The Worst Place to Be a Disabled Person," and it was Sophie Morgan, who is herself a wheelchair user and a BBC reporter, and she went around to different places around the world to try to find the worst place in the world to be a disabled person, and decided in the end that the worst place would be Ghana, and she showed all these horror stories of all these different people and the different situations they were in, and the culture is very religion based. So if you were a disabled person, they take you to church to try to get you cured and all sorts of horrible things. But it made me think, I wonder where the best place to be a disabled person is in the world. And I think in the UK, we're probably one of the best places to be a disabled person, because we have, no matter how rubbish it is, there is a safety net, there is welfare provision, there is social care,
Yeah.
there is a net there to catch you. You know, it's nowhere near good enough in this country at the moment. There's the cost of living crisis. Disabled people are the poorest people in society. There's heating or eating. 90% or 70% of people who use food banks are disabled people. You know, it's not a good situation, but it's a whole lot better than other countries, I think.
Well, that's what actually one reason why I came back from the States is, even though I was working in a so-called disabled research center, it was so, I would say, different from here. There is no reasonable adjustment, for example, in the States.
In the States?
Yeah, there isn't. Not really. At that time, I didn't really know what my rights are or where I was, for example, and I have a chronic fatigue. And sometimes at long meetings, I could drop off for a minute or so. And the person who was like my boss was laughing at me, was criticizing me after that. And she didn't realize about chronic fatigue. And she was a non-disabled person on top of that. And I was like, I've enough of that. You know, I couldn't take it. I mean, that isn't the only reason, but that was one of the reasons. As a disabled, because everybody was going on to me about how much better the United States was on disability rights.
Well,
Well,
that's what we hear, because the Americans with Disabilities Act, and so I thought it was very good.
yes, it is, but it doesn't mean that it's to solve all. It is good, for example, for access, for, like, you can complain and you could sue them. However, there are other things that are also important that is not included. For example, what do they consider as disability, as impairment, and etc. So I'm not going to write, I'm not going to do a PhD on that, but it does make a difference. And maybe because, because I campaign in this country, and because I have seen what is so-called overseas, I wouldn't say that the UK is the best, because I don't have that quantitative analysis, However, I'm happy. I would be betraying myself by saying I'm happy here, would I? I would say I am happier here. Maybe because I've been longer here. And also, Sophie might have talked about Ghana being the worst, but it all depends on which part of the country you're in. For example, you could be like one of those people in John Pring's book that the DWP got at. I wouldn't, that might be just as bad or worse than somebody who is quite well off in Ghana, for example. So it all depends on your status, on your heritage, on how much you have. You know, I mean, talk about the United States. You could be extremely worse off if you're one of the people of color in one of the worst states like Atlanta or US, you know, the sort of back streets of New York, that sort of thing. And I say that because I don't think that you can compare like that. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. No, it's very situational. It's very individual, and it's very, there are some places which will definitely be better than others, and which will be different for different groups of people. It's very situational and very specific. Listen, that's been fabulous. Thank you very much. That's been about an hour. Thank you very much for your time. I just think what we ought to do before we say goodbye is plug your podcast. If people want to find your podcast, where would they find it? What's it called?
I think it's called About Nasi Goreng and Fried Rice, or Between Nasi Goreng and Fried Rice. Nasi Goreng means fried rice in Malay.
Right.
So it's about me being a Southeast Asian and Chinese. And what are the differences? So the people I talk to, interview, are people who have a Southeast Asian heritage, but are situated in the West. How do they deal with it?
Brilliant. So if people want to find that, then I guess in all the usual podcast homes.
They can just look up my name under podcasts, and I'm sure that will come out. I have a website.
And your name is Eleanor Lisney.
Yes, but my website is under Theo Lisney.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time and for your insight and for your history. And it's been absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I hope that was. I feel like I've been rambling all over the place.
That's what happens in these podcasts. That's what we do. Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you. Bye bye.